now, as we did yesterday, there are the other members of this round table that have not yet taken the word. So I can start from Bonnie. Can you start and say something about what you have heard this morning? What are your reactions?
Well, I could say a lot, but I'm going to try to reduce this to a few words in the interest of time. First of all, I think it's wonderful to hear these scientific presentations and to understand that it's possible to reduce this kind of amorphous situation that we're all confronting and describing anecdotally into something that can be harnessed with a formula that could actually result in an empirical decision about how to transfer these, how to cover this gap, or these incremental costs, as you refer to them. And when I made my reference to the university as a critical element in the regeneration of cities, it was because not only do universities attract intellectual talent, but they serve as incubators for thinking and for concentrating ideas, as we've just, the kinds of studies that Mr. Levin has been involved in apparently all of his life, and many other economists and ecologists. And I'd also like to say that another big gap that exists, which has been one of my concerns over the course of my career, is the gap between advocates for conservation on the natural side and conservation on the cultural side. And these two worlds tend not to speak to each other. And although there are conservationists, nature conservationists concerned with urban resources, they tend to think of these as natural resources. Things having to do with pollution, with water resources, with waste control, and not necessarily with communities. They may think of community action, but not in relation to the built environment. And the built environment has traditionally been thought about, and you can go back to the Venice Charter of 1964 as something, as a province of the world of culture. And the world of culture and society have tended to see, the world of culture has been seen as a subset of society, and a very elite subset that's not really part of the world that we all live in. And so building that kind of community consensus that we all need to care about these assets and preserve them collectively and make sure they're integrated into policy. There hasn't been a will on the part of the community to address this, particularly on the part of the global community. Preservationists who have a bad reputation for being old ladies in tennis shoes and the kinds of people who once tied themselves to trees have not really been able to operate beyond a community level, with a few exceptions. Actually, one of the exceptions is Venice, where the community did rally after the 1966 flood. But I think there's a certain amount of fatigue on the part of the people who responded to that challenge. And in addition, the private committees for Venice, which almost exclusively focus on the built environment, not on the lagoon and the larger environmental context, have been invited to stay out of political discussions and have agreed to do so until now. So I think this discussion is rich with new precedents. And I just want to make one other reference in relation to Mr. Levin's reference to the idea of a club. Venice has, as part of its tradition, the idea of the confraternity that bands together in the interest of the community and delivers public goods by way of its ability to be influential in a positive way for society. So maybe there's a tradition here that the community would understand and find it challenging to try to build upon. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And then I move to here.
Yes, thank you. Well, it was an interesting lecture Yves gave us about the 7 plagues, but I thought for a while you were talking about my country. So this is a bit universal indeed, that leadership is difficult at many places, and over-regulation, of course, in our Western societies is widespread. But I think the point you made, you know, lifting the whole problem to an international level will not work. I intuitively support that conclusion you made. And we discussed yesterday at lunch also with the UNESCO Secretary General, or Director General, and she was willing to say, to kind of make a proposal to Venice, including a concrete future. And I think I agree with you that a top-down direction for Venice and for Italy will not work. But we discussed then the idea that UNESCO could help to organize a process. And such process could include Charles Perrings, his recommendation, see what the GF can do. Maybe not in terms of big money, but at recognition at the international level and more attention for the role of international funding. But it would probably be limited, but at least it helps to organize this kind of process of bringing together the stakeholders in Venice at all levels, including, and then not through top-down, but through participatory approaches of all these levels and confronting them. And finally, well, I think the whole economic theory and evolutionary economics is useful, but in the end it boils down indeed to the rather straightforward proposals that Charles made, a local tax for tourists, and see whether we can engage some international attention and financial support for this notion of a global common. And in the end, many of us indeed again spoke about the young, and Yves spoke about rediscovering, reconquering the mainland. So I see some elements that came up yesterday, come up today again, the young, the mainland, and some kind of regulatory things to generate the funds. So my conclusion is we're converging to a large extent.
Yes, yes. Sure. Thank you, Greg.
Thank you. Yeah, it's been fascinating listening to the contributions this morning. There are a couple of things that Charles and Simon said which really rang a bell with me, which is in the field of leisure, we've been doing a lot of work on rituals, and the idea of leisure as a set of social practices which have a lot in common with the development of ritual. And if you look at the work by Randall Collins on ritual interaction chains, then you start to recognize a lot of, in particular, what Simon was talking about in terms of tourism being developed as a kind of social practice within modern society, which takes on certain forms, which are now becoming dysfunctional. And this idea of people's positions relative to that ritual, whether you are in a central position relative to the ritual or whether you are an outsider, becomes an important part of the discussion, because the tourists may be at the center of the ritual as far as we look at it in cities like Venice. We see the tourists, they are the people doing the tourism and so on. And then the people who are getting the disbenefits are the people very often who are outside that ritual. So your position relative to tourism is very, very important. And if we think about it in that way, then perhaps we also begin to recognize that the way that tourism as a ritual is talked about is still too much focused on the position of the people in the tourist industry in this whole question. That we address tourism via the hoteliers, via the cruise ships and so on, when perhaps we should be thinking about if tourism is a collective ritual, the way to influence the behavior is not via the companies that provide the infrastructure or the software, but via the individual tourists themselves and the way in which the ritual of tourism is developed. because essentially it's the form of tourism which is the problem for Venice. It's not the tourists themselves. So that was just something which chimed a lot with the kind of work that we've been doing recently. And I think just coming back to the point that Charles made about the possible links with the global environmental facility, we talk about World Heritage as very often as built heritage, but then we forget the fact that also within UNESCO there is natural heritage. So that could actually be a way of bringing World Heritage into the global environmental facility via the idea that it's also the environment. And of course, for Venice, this is crucial because it is about Venice as a city, but also about its relationship with the lagoon. So I think there are things that we can work with there. Thank you.
Thank you, but also the environmental heritage in Venice is in a sense a built heritage, because the lagoon is the result of a choice. And concerning the debate, the point you raised before about the length of the debates in Italy, I was thinking about how many decades the Republic of Venice took before deciding to divert the rivers Brenta and Piave and to allow the lagoon to exist as it is now. So it's a long history in this situation. Sorry. Please, Charles, go on.
I just want to take a slightly different tack. What I'm always interested in is mindset shift and how people change their behavior, and how in cities you create context with all of this knowledge that is usually obscure to most people, how that is communicated. And one of the best phrases I saw in your presentation was 3 words which said, "in plain English." And I thought that was great that you did that, because I think a lot of this is about communication. In the sense there are different types of people discussing these problems, and we need to find a common language that is both rich and simple, which is easier said than done, so that in its simplicity doesn't become simplistic and meaningless, but at the same time resonates strongly enough to, in the receiver, the listener, create an effect which ideally is, in some sense, iconic not in the sense of buildings. And I think a lot of what you're all trying to bring together is a series of stats and stories. I think really the thing about stats and stories is a very significant way of trying to move forward on many of these issues, which are like spaghetti in the sense of complex and all of that. So I think there is not only the gap between the incremental cost issues you described, there's the gap in the languages we use to describe what is obviously quite difficult to describe. But given that we want to move forward and we want these different groups that are affected, for example, within Venice, outside Venice, and the world as a whole, to somehow come together. And part of that communication strategy, I believe, is not only language, obviously, and how these things are described and communicated, but also many of the things we're talking about are relatively invisible. They're visible to you, perhaps, but they're invisible to the outsider. And making the invisible visible through animation is really quite significant. And that's where you can get a link between the sort of issues that Greg's talking about, tourism being a certain form of modern ritualism, or we have a modern version of that, is finding types of activities and events that bring these messages that we're talking about through to this combination of very diverse visitors that we have in Venice, because obviously they're not all one type. So that's all I'll say, apart from the fact that I like your radical suggestions, and I think they, as I'll say later, they should be part of the common sense, even if we neglect them and say they don't work. I think they need to be there on the table as something quite ordinary, rather than always trying to come to one thing. So that's all I'll say.
Thank you. Finally, Joan, please.
No, I think there were many interesting points this morning. I would perhaps I'd like to take back some of the points that Yves made on relation with this possible strategy of mixing together a certain idea of national interest, which I think that would be very good. And also the idea that then that should be reflected into also a wider space that could be Città Metropolitana. But I think we have to be aware that today perhaps what we are facing are completely different than the traditional way that we are always calling Città Metropolitana or the regional planning. I mean, I think this is very important, and that is what probably the other speakers put on the table this morning in terms of environmental issues, that they are very, very important today, that the situation, I feel that Venice is not only the problem of the tourism, I think it's really is a serious problem in terms of all the deindustrialization is still something that needs to be solved. I mean, there are many different issues. And then, for instance, I feel that probably the key, at least the way as I see, is try to make this discussion integrative. I think Venice has a lot of studies. We tend to imagine, even in our table, we tend to imagine by disciplines or by themes. And we respect each other and we try to learn from each other. But what is very important is what comes out of it, is how the things could be together. Usually, that was what we usually call the planning. And Venice has fantastic experience in the 20s, but mainly in the 50s, Sant'Anna did a fantastic proposal that is still a paradigm. Sant'Anna did a fantastic work for Venice. But these type of paradigms are not any longer possible. Today is a different thing. I mean, it's the way that, and I like this approach because probably it makes two things. You said, well, you need the vision, but you need to manage the situation. And those are the key things, is the way. And that you have to build, and usually that is usually something that doesn't come, well, from the city itself. It comes from, in a way, from another type of federation. And then I feel that in this respect, perhaps Venice needs Venice Island, Venice Lagoon, needs a different focus that perhaps could be the area of the airport. And I think you have to establish this type of asymmetry that should be into that system. Otherwise, it's not possible to consider, because some of the key problems are there or some other problems are there. And I think this is what is being always strategic planning about. But I insist that we have to take today into account other paradigms. And these paradigms has nothing to do with what was the development base type of development that was the way that the city has been considered 20 years ago, even 10 years ago. I think this for me is quite essential, and probably is what we can learn from other cities and what other speakers are putting on the table. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So now I propose to give again the floor to the three speakers to react to the reactions. Simon, are still with us? Are you still with us?
Still with you.
Okay, so I will follow the same order, and starting with Yves. Then, after your reaction, I have three questions for all the speakers of the table. So I don't think we have time for a second round. So after your reaction, I will read the questions and you react to the question, okay? So, please.
Very briefly, your first question, I mean, you mentioned this Comitatone, which was a kind of super committee chaired by the Prime Minister with the presence of ministers. Actually, it was a kind of super conferenza dei servizi, with the same defect. That is, it's nice to put up the decision at the highest level, provided that you take decisions and that you manage to implement this decision. Otherwise, it's just, pushing up, and that's it. Second issue which has been raised, I fully share, I mean, the proposal put forward by Charles. I wonder, however, if he would accept the idea that in order to sweeten a bit the taxation, that taxations be related also to the provision of services. For instance, rather high tax, obviously, because it has to be rather high, unfortunately, but which would provide a free transport for those paying the tax, because you include. And that would also avoid cheating, because I have noted that so many people get into the boats, but they don't have tickets, or they don't pay. So you would kill two birds with one stone. Thirdly, the argument of pro-sociability, which has been presented to us. I think it's very important that norms, legal norms, be rooted in social norms, or because it makes implementation more secure. And we have a good example in Venice, which was La Magistratura delle Acque, that is the regulating of water, was like in Netherlands. I mean, it comes from, unfortunately, the change in the community, the disruption into the fabric of the community at an end. And the Magistratura delle Acque has been transferred to the central ministry. I have not much confidence in this decision, but we have to accept that the local commons are not anymore protected or shared by the community, because the Venetian community is mainly made of tourists. And these tourists have no common sociability. It's a cohort of anomic individuals. They come, they visit, but there is no sociability between these peoples and the crowds that we see on the Zattere or on the bridges. So this is a big challenge for Venice, and that's the reason I don't believe much in a kind of Ostrom strategy, except for some aspects, but certainly not for the crucial aspects such as the management of tourism.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So, Charles.
Okay, just two things. One, I think Bonnie's pointed out a really important thing, that we currently separate out the way we treat conservation issues in the built environment relative to the natural environment. And there is no reason why we should do this. The natural environment is, in a sense, no longer natural. It's anthropogenically structured. The built environment clearly is anthropogenically structured. We ought to be dealing with these things in exactly the same way. And the challenges in each of them very often are extremely similar. So I absolutely support the idea that we should try to collect these things together. And it's one of the reasons for recommending that the UNESCO World Heritage Convention be combined with the other global conventions that the GF is dealing with. Second point, Simon raised the interesting question about how norms and laws are connected, and made the observation that norms can become codified as laws. Well, Anne Kinzig, who was changing Simon's pages, would, if given the opportunity, point to an example that works in the other direction. That very often we start with little laws that are designed to deal with particular problems. And the example she would give, I think, is recycling. That you start something with a restriction, people object to that restriction initially, but as they become used to it, you no longer need the restriction. So it seems to me that you can get a norm coming out in the other direction from a restriction or regulation on behavior. And I'd just like to think that we could imagine them working in both directions, that there may be a mechanism that in one case works best through education, the creation of social norms, and in another case might work best by putting on some little restriction that subsequently changes behavior and becomes a social norm.
Thank you, Charles. Simon, would you say something? Yes.
Yes, so I just have a few points to make. First of all, I wanted to follow up on Charles's last point to emphasize that the importance of understanding that social norms and laws have to co-evolve. That it's very difficult to implement laws unless there's social support for it, and yet as the laws come in, that can increase social support. So I would certainly endorse what Charles's last point and suggest that as we're seeing with the case of climate change and the co-evolution of public attitudes and agreements, there has to be a co-evolution between them. Secondly, I'm a little more optimistic than the earlier speaker about pro-sociality, but in general, I think that we've learned that, and my example of the financial markets and how Adam Smith's invisible hand is not the whole solution, emphasizes that dealing with these problems has to involve some combination of top-down and bottom-up solutions. I certainly think we're going to need some top-down solutions like taxes, but there are intermediate steps. I'd like the suggestion, which I thought I understood, carry it a step further, that one could create a situation where frequent visitors to Venice might become club members and get benefits like the ability to ride the Vaporetto simply showing their badges because they've made contributions. They've paid a voluntary tax or something that provides them certain benefits. When we think about, when I talked about clubs, I talked about different levels of belonging to the clubs. You could simply belong to the club, or you could be within the club, be a mitigator. We have to think about this in a hierarchical way. There are immediate beneficiaries of any actions. There are indirect beneficiaries. There are those who would simply want to see things proceed because of their pro-social attitudes. And there are the global facilities that Charles referred to that might be inclined to contribute to this if there's enough support for it. So we have to think about this in a structured way and combine the bottom-up and top-down solutions.
Thank you very much. Now, I have a few questions for all of you. First, Andreina, a colleague of mine in UAV, Architecture University, she sends 3 documents. I think they should be shared they are documents presented to the UNESCO. They are recommendations. 2 of them are recommendations from the UNESCO Istanbul meetings. And one is a list of cose da fare, what we should do to move towards the sustainability of Venice. I have them here. They are in Italian. Most of you read also Italian. I think they should be shared later on. But Andreina also has a question. And the question is related to something that has been touched this morning. How can we assure sustainability to Venice, where the local population, which is now 55,000 people, is decreasing and can reach a minimum in 25 years? And in which sense can we say whether Venice or not is different from the cases that have been presented yesterday, such as Mexico City, Denver, Amsterdam, etc.? This is the first point raised by Andreina. I have a second question without a name, but anyway, again, this question refers to the fact that the population is falling. It's approaching to the population of the historical center is approaching to the 25% of the total population of the municipality. And this question refers to the periodic requests, there is also one in this moment, of referendum to arrive to a division of this administration. So the question is, concerning what you have said, also you this morning, what do the experts think about potential advantages and disadvantages or risk of separately the administration of these 2 realities taking also account that the population of Venice are so low. So this is, this I think I have summarized this question. The third one is different, and it is related also to what has been said yesterday, and it concerns this is Paola. What do you think about the appropriate right messages to unleash this process which has been invoked to make Venice becoming attractive to a new creative economy of young, skilled, high-tech workers? And how can you combine this request, this need, with the existence of a large, short-sighted community of citizens who are not looking according to a long-run period, but they thrive on the easy earnings that come from touch-and-go tourism? This is the question. So I think we can start from the speakers, for example, from Yves, then Charles, then Simon, and then if some of you also have to add something, it's okay. So, Yves.
Well, concerning the independence of the historical Venice, that is a separation from Mestre and the mainland, I can fully understand the frustration that in reality there is an automatic majority of the mainland over the historical part. But I don't think this would address the problem, which in my view, again, it's a problem which includes the lagoon and the mainland. And so some solutions have to be found in order to avoid that the historical city be trapped into the politics of local politics, but separation does not seem to me a good solution, because the risk would be running a dead city, because the historical city cannot live and survive and prosper without, let's say, its environment. The second question was about...
that was the second question.
Yeah.
The first one was about the sustainability of the situation.
Yeah,
Thanks, you have answered.
The
sustainability with 55,000 people.
I think there is an absolute and urgent need of proactive policies, such as I repeat myself, housing, but also the creation of perhaps of research centers who might, but also private, public-private partnership. For instance, I would just mention an example which is taking place now in Paris. There has been a complete restructuration of a neighborhood, and which is brand new, except a few buildings which have been kept, including a huge building which is protected because it's an example of early 20th century buildings. Okay, it has been protected. It's huge. This property belongs to the state, but the states or the city provide the building, offer the building to a private company manager who is launching a kind of lab for young people in the field of digital research. So the purpose is to have, if I'm not wrong, 900 potential units of research within that huge building. And it's a very nice combination of private support, public support for a joint common purpose. So I think Venice needs this kind of new dynamism in order to avoid to be trapped with the tourist option.
Thank you very much. Charles?
Well, not very much to say on some of these, and the first one was directed more to Bonnie. What are the differences with the other cities? But I will just say a brief word about sustainability. We did talk about resilience yesterday, and the key to sustainability seems to me to be the capacity to deal with change in an uncertain world. There are some things that are going to remain constant in Venice, but there's an awful lot that's going to have to change as the world around us changes. And being flexible, being adaptive, being creative, these seem to me to be the criteria that will allow Venice to respond to different challenges over time. The same thing, it turns out, is what will be needed to allow the emergence of new industries. And maybe they'll be digitally based, but I think this is far from certain. What you can do is create an open, encouraging environment for new startups. You can create these public-private partnerships that will make it possible for people to incur some of the deep expenses that are involved in establishing in a place like this. Being flexible, being adaptive, being imaginative, these are the keys.
Thank you. Simon, would you react to these three questions?
See these three questions as interrelated. And so I'd like to address them all at once. I agree that it would not be a good idea to separate the historic Venice. It would make Venice more like Pompeii. You'd be looking at what used to be a city and is now a historic site. So I think ways have to address the sustainability issues, to address the issue of how do you get young people interested in Venice. One has to increase the ownership, make Venice an international city, create core activities. The universities and FEAM and the Fondazione Cini, these provide some examples of this, but if you want to really build that up, Venice can be a place where a lot of the sorts of issues that are particular to Venice are extended out to deal with sustainability issues and the problems other cities and nations are facing, make Venice an international city. And because of the structure of things, a lot of those new institutions are probably going to have to be in places like Mestre. There isn't room on most of the main island for that to happen, but if they are close, just like where the FEAM is, these will be part of Venice. These will ensure the integration of it and the creation of new centers that will attract people. And we send our students to the University of Venice to do internships, but just a few students. Make this Ignazio Musu was involved with the international university sitting out on one of the islands. Create more of those sorts of activities that will bring young people in, make Venice more, increase the international ownership, increase the members of the club, and provide more integration of the peripheral areas to historic Venice.
Thank you, Simon, and thank you for having remembered the Venice International University. But now I think that some of you have something to add to respond to this question. Bonnie, can you start?
Well, I would also like to take all of those questions as one, since they are interrelated. And trying to boil down my thinking from these discussions, it seems to me that we have in this environment 4 communities of users. We have the so-called Venetians, who are no longer here, so as it is said, although I'm not so convinced that they're no longer here. But it's an aging and declining population that's being. Then we have the people who live in Mestre and Marghera, who seem not to be considered Venetian, since this is actually an urban area of several 100,000 people, not a declining 55,000, but who have some stake in this environment and who, for the most part, work in the city and therefore are inhabitants during the daytime hours. We have non-resident owners who are somewhat vilified in this context for not being here, but in reality, many of whom have a very big stake in this place and care a great deal about its future. And we have the visitors, some of whom are also committed to Venice and frequent visitors, or people who come for stays of enrichment like all of us have over the course of our lives. And then we have these casual visitors who seem to be causing the problem. So we have to reconsider the balance. And there's been a reference in yesterday's conversation for the need for triggers that will start things moving in another direction if we can't really achieve a kind of overall policy and governance change that many people seem to consider desirable, and which would be the ultimate outcome of some kind of thought process that's beginning here at this gathering. I think, first of all, we need to know more. There have been many references to the fact that there aren't the right statistics in place in terms of the benefits and costs of this whole process in terms of the conditions of the environment, and many of these, we could get our hands on a lot of this information with a more concerted effort. We need more small-scale experiments, those kinds of things everyone's referring to, engaging young people. When I returned from dinner the other night on the Vaporetta was full of young people who were going someplace on the Giudecca Island for the night. So clearly there's some kinds of things going on to try to stimulate this kind of youthful activity. And I certainly saw a transformation happen in New York City in the 70s when I first lived there, by young people inhabiting neighborhoods that were underutilized because those were places where they could find opportunities. But maybe there's not enough known about where those opportunities are. And then the need for tax and transformed uses of the city by transportation, that sort of thing, being both from the top down and the bottom up. From the top down, I'm not sure I know how that would be achieved, but surely this is the opening of a dialogue that might result in some kind of concrete actions. From the top, but from the bottom up, I think Venice needs champions who, and there are many local groups who are involved in advocacy activities, and maybe more than there need to be, but I think there's a lack of coordination within these efforts, and the lack of an individual or group that really speaks for the future of the city, to whom the community from the bottom up level can connect. And I just want to refer back to the presentation that I made about New Orleans, which is a city that has great economic disparities, and that's one of the things that they want to correct. And their strategic goal was to create a culture culture for conservation, and get everybody in the community, starting with children in the school, to realize that without preserving the wetlands, without preserving the environment, there would be no future. So I conclude on that.
Thank you. Pierre?
Yes, well, I'll take all three in one. I've come to Venice over the last 30 years many times, and you speak with people, and what I've seen that this question has been on the table for 30 years already, how to revitalize the historic city. And there were proposals, for example, to build a new economy based on ICT and coastal engineering works even. At the Arsenale, facilities have been built with government subsidy, and some initiatives have been taken. But the idea always was to build an economy in parallel or next to the tourist economy. And they were not considered to be integrated. But some things have happened, but not very successful. The second line of initiatives has always been, to build international universities and to encourage cultural festivities in the historical center. I think that has been successful to some extent, but not half enough, not by far enough to revitalize the city. And I've seen, I remember Lady Clark from the UK, Save Venice, of Venice in Peril group, and she was always in favor of low-cost housing in the historical city. But even she made very little progress. I mean, they found some funders, and there was one building and maybe 70 apartments, and everyone was happy. But, you know, my idea is I've seen a growing dichotomy between the historical center governance and the mestre and the mayor's and city council priorities. And this, of course, has a historical background. I mean, the cultural elite at the historical center was not trusted by the common man in Mestre and the politicians. And when the question is put before us whether to separate or integrate, I think, you know, the historical center needs the lagoon, needs the other communities around the lagoon, and needs the mainland very badly for the airport, for the ports, for dispersing the tourists. So I think we should favor this notion of integration and maybe go as far as Yves says, you know, to see whether some kind of much stronger cooperation can occur for the whole, around the whole lagoon, which is a common pool. Then to encourage startups, that starts with the young, and I think, you know, that starts with low-cost, affordable housing. So there are things, in my opinion, come together, and a referendum, I'm not sure it would help.
Thank you.
To fail. The majority is on the other side.
Great.
Just very briefly, if you want to encourage young people to come to Venice and to encourage startups, then the most crucial thing is cheap space. I mean, social housing is one thing, but people also need to be able to run a business. If you look at the most successful creative clusters in the world, they are all places which have a surplus of very cheap, usable, flexible space. So that is an absolute must.
I've got nothing to say. It's all been said.
John?
No, I feel that for me the key words are integration and diversity. I think Venice is done by many different things. I mean, even when we take the islands, they are very different among them. The lagoon is the element that makes them integrated. I think that probably is one of the.
Okay, thank you very much. We are at the end of our session. Thank you to all the speakers, to the other participants, to those who have raised some questions. Thank you to Simon, who now probably we are going to have lunch, we are going to have breakfast. So, no, sure. And we reconvene here at 3 o'clock. The debate will go on, and there will be the last 3 presentations, and Michela Fontana will chair. Thank you very much.